Good morning, everyone. We're just short of a minute out of the start of our meeting, so we will be with you shortly. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Reinen from the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and your facilitator for this meeting. We will now begin turning the mic over to the chair of the Governor's Task Force on Student Debt, Department of Financial Institutions Secretary Kathy Blumenfeld.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome back to meeting 3. Again, I hope that you and your loved ones are doing well during these very challenging times. I know that the recent unrest related to racial injustice, in addition to the pandemic, is only exacerbating the struggles of those with student debt. I want to thank you, each of you, for taking the time to be here today. Your participation in this task force is even more important than ever. So let's begin our work. We have another full meeting ahead. First, a big thanks to everyone who participated in the survey after meeting 2. Your feedback will help us do the best job possible while operating in this virtual world where we can't be physically together. We will share the full results of the survey in the pre-meeting materials before our next meeting, but in the meantime, here's some of the feedback we received. Overall, you said things are going as well as possible under the circumstances. The meeting's well planned and the information is timely. A few of you, including me, would like more breaks. So we've built more time into today's session and we'll be sure to do so in the future too. The chat feature, some of you love it and a few of you find it very distracting. A reminder that you can easily turn the chat feature on and off in your settings to fit your needs. If you decide to chat a question during the speaker's presentation, then out of courtesy, we suggest that the question be germane to the speaker's expertise. We also heard that many of you like chatting in questions and receiving the presenter's answers in the post-session materials, even though most of us would prefer to meet face-to-face and have more interactive discussions. So to that end, we're reserving the last part of today's meeting to break into small groups to facilitate dialogue on the topics that we've heard about to date and provide an opportunity for the task force members to interact. And finally, we heard many of you enjoy hearing from borrowers directly, so we will alternate borrower stories with discussion activities. I also want to call to your attention to the proposed recommendations tracker that was included in your pre-meeting materials. This is our effort to identify the suggested recommendations for task force consideration. While we're sharing this working we will be sharing this working document with you at each meeting so you can help keep track of recommendations. We will circle back to these initiatives in later meetings as we prioritize them for our final report. As you can tell, we have a lot to accomplish in a relatively short time frame, and we appreciate everyone's cooperation. This is a great group of experts and I'm honored to lead this effort on behalf of Governor Evers. So with that, I will pass the ball over to Michelle to continue on with the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. So next on our agenda is today's agenda. And so as you can see, we have a number of expert speakers to hear from in relation to federal student debt update, the state's best practices and recommendations, and a refinancing overview and recommendations. And as the Secretary mentioned, we will have breakout rooms that are facilitated by 4 of our task force members. So we are excited to move forward with this agenda, but first we need to do our roll call, and we will be using the chat feature again. That seemed to work well. You all got ahead of me, which is excellent. So we will give it a shot again and see how I can keep up. So beginning with our chair, Kathy Blumenfeld, and then we have Derek Campbell and Connie Hutchinson. Okay, I know Connie is there. I see her in the participant list. Laura Sutherland. And in for Kiona Jones is Laia Thomas and Larry Graves. Jeff Brandt, sorry. Thank you very much. And Brandon Trujillo. And Rebecca Larson. Representative Baldwin. I saw Representative Baldwin in the participant list. We'll go with Representative Hesselbein. Thank you. Senator Smith. And we have Shannon Holsey. I believe I saw Shannon in the list today. Mashoud Akhtar. Thank you. Kiamani Alford. And Karen Bauer. And Shannon Conlin. Thank you. Jody Chung. Lucy Fenzel. And Renee Gesh. Sure. And Austin Hammond. And Marisha Harris. Great, thank you, Renee. Howard Pez, ahead of me. Derek Kindle. Shane, okay, great. Shane Maloney is in for Derek, thank you. Paul Kundert. And Kevin McShane. Jamie Miller. And not hearing from Jamie Miller, but Michael Madursky. Thank you. Michael Rosen. And Alexandra Shade. I believe I saw you in the participant list. Sylvie Eisen. Thank you. Casey Wachniak. Thank you, everyone, for running through roll call. A couple we'll check back with as time moves forward in the breakout rooms. So just a reminder that we will ask participants, as the Secretary mentioned, to continue to submit their questions related to the presentations using the chat function. When doing so, if you could use the everyone feature, that would be great, so everyone can see those questions that are happening versus sending those to the host. that will help us facilitate the asking of the questions as we move forward today. Next, I'm going to turn it back over to the chairs, Secretary Blumenfeld.
Great, thank you. And I'd love to have the great honor and privilege of introducing U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin. Senator Tammy Baldwin was born and raised in Madison and is proudly representing Wisconsin in the United States Senate. Before being elected to the Senate, Senator Baldwin worked as a lawyer in private practice. She served in the Wisconsin State Assembly from 1993 to 1999 and 7 terms in the United States House of Representatives from 1999 to 2013. Senator Baldwin has made addressing the student debt crisis and college affordability a top priority, leading many efforts in introducing legislation to meet problems with solutions. We're delighted to have Senator Baldwin with us here today to give a federal student debt update. Welcome, Senator Baldwin.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Blumenfeld. It's a delight to get to join you, and I'm so pleased that this task force exists and is working so hard. I want to use my time to provide a bit of an overview of particularly measures relating to student debt that have been passed during the pandemic through the CARES Act, as well as projecting ahead at what additional steps might be taken as we look at further response legislation to the pandemic, and then sort of a broader overview, hopefully quickly, of the Higher Education Act reauthorization. But I'm just going to start with some basic facts that I think everybody participating is well aware of, that aggregate student debt in the United States is now over $1.7 trillion. When I first joined the United States Senate and joined colleagues working on this issue, it was $1.5 trillion. And the other milestone met in those years back then was it surpassing all other forms of debt except for mortgage debt. And so that is just, a staggering figure. And about 45 million Americans shoulder this student debt burden. More than 1 in 4 right now are behind in their student debt repayment. And it is certainly, as we all know, limiting the ability of Americans to build their lives and pursue their dreams. And the burden is not equally distributed. We know that the student debt burden disproportionately exacerbates existing economic, gender, and racial inequalities. So what has the Senate and House recently done? During the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis that has accompanied it, we've passed a number of different measures through Congress, the most recent large measure being the CARES Act. The CARES Act endeavored to basically include some short-term relief for many of those who have student debt, providing a 6-month pause in the repayments for those with loans held by the federal government. However, I was disappointed that the CARES Act did not provide any level of loan forgiveness at all, nor did it ensure that those who had debt from commercially held loans would have any sort of relief. They didn't share in this repayment relief. More recently, the House has passed the HEROES Act, and that is their sort of 4th package for coronavirus pandemic relief. The Senate has not yet put forward its counterpart to that, nor has the leader brought forth the HEROES Act for us to consider what the House has passed. But I will say It's noteworthy what the HEROES Act contained because it will inform how the Senate deals with student debt issues in a next package. The HEROES Act addressed many of the shortcomings that I just described in the CARES Act by providing $10,000 in loan forgiveness for economically distressed borrowers. And I'm certainly going to push for more relief for student borrowers as the Senate takes up the next COVID relief package. I wanted to turn a little bit to the higher education reauthorization. So the Senate HELP Committee, which stands for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, on which I serve, has been actively working to reauthorize the Higher Education Act, actually for some years now, with extensive hearings and I would say extensive progress towards consensus on that measure. However, the COVID-19 crisis has really upended the timeline that we were talking about just a month or two ago. Nevertheless, it needs to be reauthorized, and it's imperative that we use that opportunity to further address student indebtedness. I'd like to discuss three measures that I have introduced and or strongly support in this space. First of what is one that should be quite familiar to folks because it's been around for a while, back to when debt was 1.5 trillion, not 1.7 trillion. And that is Senator Warren's Bank on Student Emergency Loan Refinancing Act. So this measure would allow holders of public or private undergraduate debt to refinance those loans to an interest rate of 3.76%. It's called Bank on Student Emergency Loan Refinancing Act because it is indexed to what interest rate we loan money to banks. And we have a lot of interest in making sure that people have access to high quality, affordable education likewise. So it would allow undergraduates to refinance to that low percentage rate. It would also allow graduate students and parent borrowers to refinance to competitive rates. It wouldn't be that same 3.76%, but they would be much more competitive. And as we know, some of the debt is extraordinarily high interest rates. Second, we have a real concern about predatory actors and other bad actors in the student debt space that can cause borrowers even more harm through fraud. And it's why I introduced the Stop Student Debt Relief Scams Act. And it's a bipartisan act. I introduced it along with my colleague, Senator Braun of Indiana. What it does is give the Department of Education and the Department of Justice more tools to go after these debt scammers who offer borrowers help for a fee in accessing things that would otherwise already be free to those student and graduate borrowers. Things like income-based repayment and loan forgiveness programs. These scammers often end up really putting their victims much farther into debt and trouble by taking their fees, their money for fees, and disappearing, allowing the borrower's loans to enter delinquency and default, oftentimes for a period of time that the borrower doesn't even know that that's happening. So this bill would help provide the tools to address these scams, and also requiring colleges and universities to really warn their students about these scams and provide a clear and protective way for good actors like consumer groups and student groups to help borrowers access relief. Finally, while I believe we have to take these steps to relieve the burden for current borrowers, we also should change the rules moving forward for prospective students. The next generation should not have to experience the debt load that this generation has. We have to do that by making college more affordable. Now, I support many of the proposals that are out there legislatively to bolster our current federal financial aid programs, like expanding the Pell Grant program and certainly strengthening loan forgiveness programs for public service. I think we desperately need to do that. But I also think we need to make new investments. And it's why I have introduced the America's College Promise Act. This bill would create a new federal-state partnership to support making 2 years of community college, technical college, or tribal college free to all students. And this would be tuition-free for all students. States would have to match with $1 every $3 they receive from the federal government for such a program. And students could use this program to get a 2-year degree, an industry recognized credential, or credits towards a 4-year program, all without taking on debt to cover tuition and fees. And so I certainly want to see us take bolder action for the next generation of students seeking higher education. And with that, why don't I wrap up formal comments and enter dialogue or Q&A?
Thank you very much, Senator, for the update. And I will ask any task force members if they have any questions for the Senator, please submit those via our chat function. And a reminder, if you are participating by the phone as a task force member, please submit your question to the Student Debt Task Force at dfi.wisconsin.gov. This is your opportunity with the Senator task force members, so please take advantage. The first question that has come in, Senator, is what impact has COVID had on the student debt crisis?
Oh, well, it's had an enormous impact. So first of all, those who carry student debt, we've seen unemployment numbers rise like we haven't seen since the Great Depression. 40 million Americans find themselves furloughed or laid off. Some describe this disruption as temporary. Others obviously describe this as permanent job loss. And while there are programs that have been implemented above and beyond what would normally be available through the states for people who are unemployed, we have seen the system sort of buckle under the demand. That includes a state like Wisconsin, where just the human resources for processing all of the unemployment insurance claims is leading to significant delays. There was also, as you know, the direct stimulus payment that was authorized in the CARES Act. And while most of those have gone out, there are still individuals who are still struggling to locate their stimulus payment. And so there's been huge interruptions in income. And that means that more individuals are unable to keep up with payments. And as I mentioned earlier in the CARES Act, there is the deferral, but that is not forgiveness. And they're very different concepts. And so we definitely have seen the struggles of those with federal debt as well as commercial debt be very much complicated by the pandemic. Also, as I said, the relief provided in the CARES Act did not reach those borrowers who have commercial loan debt. Additionally, we know that those borrowers who are currently still in school had enormous disruptions to their education. Now, most colleges, most institutions of higher learning were able to provide online content to help people finish this spring semester, but not everything can be moved online, especially with regard to some of the technical and vocational tracks where hands-on learning is essential. But that's true also for elements of four-year institutions also. The institutions themselves are in severe financial crisis. Most refunded room and board, for example, at a residential college or university, and therefore, gave up a very significant portion of their operating revenue. And so the ability for these institutions of higher learning to continue to adapt to this pandemic, evaluate whether or not they can open doors again for residential and in-person classes, is very much up in the air. So it's just, there's a multitude of ways in which the pandemic has harmed borrowers as well as left uncertain the capacity to finish degrees, finish getting industry recognized credentials, et cetera. It has a huge impact.
Thank you. The next question we have from the task force members is there anything we can do to support you, Senator Baldwin?
Well, I really appreciate that question. Right now, as I mentioned, the House has passed the HEROES Act, which is an important next step. And while it appears that we in the Senate may not take up that bill, it has gone from, the tenor here has gone from a position of resistance to any future steps voiced by the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, to now an openness to taking a next step because it's clear that the impact of the pandemic is going to go far beyond the time limit or what was envisioned in the CARES Act. So I think that reaching out to your legislators at the congressional level is extremely important, and particularly to stress the importance of these particular provisions in the HEROES Act, which would provide further relief for people with student debt during the course of the pandemic. And then in addition, obviously it helps for people to speak out about the need to finally reauthorize the Higher Education Act. It needs to be done, and while the timeline has been upended by the pandemic, we're actually, I think, fairly close to reaching consensus on most of the provisions for the Higher Education Act. So always speaking out, using your voice, telling your stories to your elected officials at the federal level is vitally important.
And I'm combining the next two questions really that have come in. The first is, you touched on this briefly, but can you talk a bit more about the Public Service Forgiveness Program and if that will continue? And the question that came in directly after, which I believe is related, is, are the PSLF funds running out, or will more borrowers be able to get the temporary forgiveness funds for public service who received misinformation from servicers about repayment, causing them to be ineligible for that public service loan forgiveness?
Yeah, so I just want to express my strong commitment to this as especially a very important tool to allow folks the opportunities to really follow their dreams and the passion that brought them into a certain field of study. Oftentimes we find that the debt load is so high that career options really get very narrowed to jobs that are going to provide the sufficient income to repay. And then in the graduate fields, we see that even more. It's why we don't have enough primary care doctors and we have a lot of specialists, but so be it. The public service debt forgiveness programs, I know from a perspective as a senator that we get calls in our casework all the time about folks who thought they were on track to have their student debt forgiven and find that they have been they're informed that they were enrolled in the wrong program or that they didn't meet all of the criteria after having given a decade of their life to public service. And so that has been very, very unfortunate, and it's something that we have been pressing this particular Secretary of Education to to resolve in the favor of the in forgiveness of the loan. But we do need more funding for the temporary PSLF program in the next appropriations bill. And the department also really does continue to drag its feet on implementing the temporary emergency public service loan forgiveness program. And as I just said, and remedy those errors around students in the incorrect repayment plans. And so it is, a lot of this is, it would be easily resolved by the Department of Education and the Secretary, but there's been a lack of cooperation that is very concerning to me.
Thank you for that. And with the time that we have remaining and that you dedicated with our task force, I'll leave it with this final question. What are your recommendations for our task force to address that you feel would not be in direct competition of federal bills or actions that you see as likely to be passed or implemented?
I think there's an opportunity for tremendous creativity, and I recommend a couple of things. I talked about my America's College Promise Act, which would provide the first 2 years of a higher education, whether that's first 2 years to be followed by a full 4-year program, or a community college degree, industry recognized certificate of some sort. And I would reflect on the fact that since these plans have been introduced at the federal level, that we have seen a lot of public and private institutions endeavor to create these opportunities with, especially for low-income students, at the institution level. So a number of our technical colleges have created a College Promise program on their own. Facilitating this and studying how they've made that work and trying to replicate that at a greater number of institutions is one direction I would look at, because as much as I would like the America's College Promise Act to pass immediately, And I keep pressing our committee's chairman, Lamar Alexander, who comes from a state that has created a Tennessee College Promise program. I think that it is going to take a while for us to actually pass it into law. So I'd look certainly in that area of how folks have been successful in creating those tuition-free opportunities, at least for at least for some of their students, if not all. I think that in terms of loan forgiveness, or not loan forgiveness, but debt consolidation and refinancing, look at the opportunities to do that also at the state level, rather than show the federal government that this can work and that we need to be doing it too. But those would be two directions that I would certainly encourage.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. We so appreciate your time and expertise and your commitment to helping student borrowers and people that are struggling right now, and all the work that you're doing. So I know you're a busy person, and taking time out for us in our task force is really meaningful. And we will continue to work hard to help borrowers in this situation today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate all your work.
Great. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, and now we will turn our attention to Jack Porter, who is policy analyst with the National Governors Association. And Jack has served as a policy analyst on the post-secondary education team at the National Governors Association. In this role, Jack supports governor staff and state policymakers on issues of higher education, finance, quality assurance, and efforts to marry post-secondary education attainment with the needs of the state's workforce. Before joining NGA, Jack was an advocacy associate at the National College Access Network, a nonprofit that supports traditionally underserved students across the United States. Today, Jack will share with us some of the state's best practices and recommendations for addressing student debt. So welcome, Jack, and thank you for all the work you've done to help us get to this date. You've been a tremendous help to the task force. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Secretary Blumenfeld, for that introduction and for having me today. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jack Porter. I'm a policy analyst on the National Governors Association's higher education team. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. Before getting started, I would just say that I'm thrilled you all have taken up this work. Student debt is probably the part of my policy portfolio at NGA that I'm most passionate about. And so I'm incredibly eager to see the progress you all make for Wisconsin student borrowers through this task force. And so with that, I'll go ahead and provide a brief overview of the material that I've put together for today. So here is a look at the topics that I'll go ahead and cover. I think the presenters that you all have heard from so far have done a great job illustrating the scope of the problem that you all are trying to tackle, and have illustrated its impact on Wisconsinites. And so I figured I'd spend my time today spotlighting a few policy interventions recently taken up by states on the issue of student debt. And so in the first portion of my presentation, which should take up a bulk of my time, I'll dig into 5 different types of policy interventions that have been implemented over the last few years at the state level. These being income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness awareness. We've already touched a little bit on that with Senator Baldwin. Consumer protection, finance, refinancing, and loan counseling. And before I dig into the details of each of those policy solutions, I'll briefly highlight why state policymakers have felt the need to undertake a policy intervention in the first place. That's not necessarily to make the case for one solution or another, or to have one solution stand above the rest. but hopefully just to demonstrate the reasons that state policymakers have acted on each issue. And during the program spotlights portion of the presentation, I'll turn to a few examples of programs that have been implemented to provide direct assistance to student borrowers in states. Again, not to necessarily advocate for one program or another, but to highlight the different approaches that have been taken on this issue and to identify the opportunity for you all to put together a policy that is best for Wisconsin. And so, great. So the first topic here is income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness awareness. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so here are just a few basics about the two programs. You have on the left the program eligibility requirements for public service loan forgiveness, or PSLF, which again did just come up in the discussion with Senator Baldwin. So as I'm sure you all know, PSLF was enacted in 2007 to provide loan forgiveness to those who, you guessed it, are working in the public service or nonprofit sector. And under PSLF, eligible borrowers can have their debt relieved after 10 years of repayment. But as you can see, though, with those check marks there, the program eligibility is not exactly straightforward. Borrowers must make all payments on time and in full, have an eligible loan, work for a qualified employer, and be enrolled in an eligible repayment program. So more to come on how that program and its eligibility requirements has proven to trip up potentially eligible borrowers here in a minute. And so alongside PSLF, we have income-driven repayment, or IDR, which allows borrowers to designate a certain amount of their monthly income, usually 10 or 15%, to go towards their monthly student loan payment. And what's critical to note here is that borrowers must recertify their income annually, and that unless a borrower proactively selects an IDR plan, they are placed into a standard repayment plan, which sets borrowers on a path to paying off their loans in 10 years' time. And that's important because this plan is often far from ideal for those who are struggling financially and have a high loan balance. And the best way that I've seen this put comes from one of our partners at the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS. And the example they give is to kind of think of it this way. A borrower who is making $35,000 a year with $30,000 in student loans, which as we've heard in prior presentations is about the average in Wisconsin. So again, that's $35,000 in income, $30,000 in student debt, would pay $141 per month in the IDR plans, in the income-driven repayment plans. However, if they did not proactively enroll in IDR and were instead in the standard plan, their monthly payment would be $345. That's more than double, and more than $200 worth of payment would be in income-driven repayment. So this is, of course, a hypothetical example and is subject to slightly different amounts depending on the interest rate. But, you get the point, and that is that income-driven repayment can be a great option for some folks who are not already enrolled. Next slide, please. Great. So here are the examples of the income-driven repayment plans. I won't spend too much time on this. I know Dr. Hillman in the first session ran through these in detail, but I figured I'd share this for you all just to have on hand. And the only thing that I would note here before moving on is that even borrowers who are ineligible for public service loan forgiveness can have their loans forgiven under these IDR plans. Granted, this comes after 20 or 25 years of successful repayment, and so it's far from a quick fix, but the option is there. Next slide, please. So here we have data from the U.S. Department of Education that demonstrates how staying in income-driven repayment is not necessarily as easy as it could be. So the department collected a sample of 1.2 million borrowers enrolled in income-driven repayment for a one-year period between November 2013 and October 2014. Now, keep in mind that as of now, again, borrowers have to annually certify their income with the Department of Ed to remain enrolled in their IDR plan. And what we see here from the sample of borrowers collected between that 2013 and 2014 period is that more than half, 57% of borrowers in an IDR plan did not recertify their income on time. And notably, of those borrowers who did not recertify on time, 31% of them went into deferment or forbearance. And those two options, of course, being hardship options, under which borrowers do not make a monthly payment and therefore don't make progress towards repaying their loans. And not to speculate too much, because we obviously can't know for sure, but what's possible is that some of the borrowers who went into deferment or forbearance did so because of the consequences that come along with not recertifying your income on time for some of these RDR plans. That includes having your interest capitalized and your monthly payment amount being reverted back to what it would have been under the standard plan. So, which, as we know, from the hypothetical borrower scenario, could be a much higher monthly payment amount. And so it's critical to support students who are trying to enroll in these plans. Now, the final point I have here is with regards to the Future Act, which, as I'm sure was enacted last year. And in short, the new federal law allows for a stronger data sharing agreement between the Department of Education and the Treasury. And the agreement would allow borrowers in IDR to give permission to the Treasury to share their income data with the Department of Education instead of filling out the income recertification application every year. That said, this data sharing agreement has not been implemented yet. And so while it's a promising prospect as far as helping borrowers remain in an IDR plan, we've yet to see any results. And again, it helps borrowers remain in a plan, but it doesn't help sort of guide them to the plan that's best for them. And before moving on to the next slide, I also wanted to make sure I mention a new report from Pew Charitable Trusts, one of our partners in Washington, D.C. on this issue of student loan repayment and income-driven repayment. And in short, what I would say is they conducted focus groups with a nationally representative sample of student loan borrowers. And I think that it provides a little bit more of a qualitative lens to the issue that I'm demonstrated here. I did send this report along to Marco. I'll put you on the spot here, Marco, for a second, earlier this month. And so I highly recommend it. And so you can get in touch if you would like to check out what borrowers had to say. Next slide, please. Okay. So here we have more data from the U.S. Department of Education that demonstrates that borrowers have had a heck of a time qualifying for PSLF. In large part, at least in my opinion, because the program, as I tried to lay out in my prior slide, is so complex. And I also know that you heard from a borrower in your first session. I believe her name was Bree, who went years thinking she was in line for public service loan forgiveness, only to find out that there was an error with her paperwork. And we also just heard from Senator Baldwin this morning about people who call her office with the same sort of story. So again, I hope that this data, both for income-driven repayment and the data that we see here for PSLF, help to quantify the stories that we hear all the time and that Bree shared with you all a couple of weeks ago. So the top line data point here, of course, is that only 10% of applications that have been submitted for PSLF have been approved. And so what I've got listed here are some of the reasons the Department of Education has listed for the denials. And so just to run through them very quickly, 14% of denials were issued because borrowers did not have an eligible loan, 23% had missing information on their application, and 59% were either not an eligible repayment plan or made fewer than the required 120 on-time and in full payments, or the payments were made while a borrower was not working for an eligible employer. All that said, I know this data can be discouraging, but what it tells me is that I think that there is an opportunity for you all to come up with a system or maybe a program to better help borrowers understand their options for repayment that are already available. In some cases, that's forgiveness. So we can go ahead to the next slide here to cover a couple of policy solutions taken up on this front. Okay, so a couple of things here. First, we have a statewide solution taken up last year in the Colorado State Legislature, as well as right in your backyard. I usually stick to statewide solutions in my presentations, but I figured I couldn't resist given the Dane County Board of Supervisors implemented something similar in 2014. And so both of these solutions are aimed at providing borrowers with the information and technical assistance they need to select the repayment or forgiveness program for which they might be eligible. And so first, just briefly with the Colorado approach. In short, the Department of Personnel was tasked with both designing informational materials on PSLF and IDR for relevant state agencies to disseminate to their employees. This was not just a state government approach, though. Agencies are also required to share informational materials with employers that are eligible for PSLF, which includes school districts, county governments, public colleges and universities, nonprofits, et cetera. And so again, at the state level, the Department of Personnel is required to provide this info to new state employees as a part of their onboarding process. And so that's Dane County. Their approach is a little bit more hands-on, and I think it's worth noting that this resolution did pass unanimously. And what it calls for is for the County Department of Administration to inform county employees of their PSLF eligibility, and maybe more critically, to help them with the necessary paperwork. Okay, next slide, please. Consumer protection. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So now, before jumping into the policy interventions that we've seen across different states, here are just a few things that I think depict what might have given momentum to the idea of providing student loan borrowers with increased protections at the state level. First is a report from the Department of Education's Inspector General that really sort of indicted the Office of Federal Student Aid for its inability to provide adequate oversight of the entities that contract with the Department of Education to administer the federal loans. Those entities, of course, are known as servicers, and servicers are the borrower's point of contact for anything regarding their loans once they enter repayment. And so to start, I think it's worth noting that the title of the report was, quote, additional actions needed to mitigate the risk of servicer noncompliance with the requirements for servicing federally held student loans. So just to touch on the report and its findings a little bit, the OIG essentially conducted an audit of FSA's oversight operations on servicers. And so just to be clear, the OIG reviewed FSA's oversight practices of servicers. They did not audit the servicers themselves. Just wanted to make sure that's clear. And so the review of the FSA data and oversight practices uncovered two findings that I think might have given momentum for state policy interventions. The first is with regard to repayment options. The OIG reviewed 73 of FSA's monthly reports on calls with borrowers, and 92% of those reports included instances of the servicer not sufficiently informing the borrower of their repayment options during a phone call. This has practical implications because, again, if a borrower is placed into forbearance instead of a potentially affordable income-driven repayment option, at least temporarily, the borrower will not make any progress towards repayment. And instead, at least in the case of forbearance, interest will still continue to accrue throughout that grace period. And so that, coupled with the evidence that FSA did not enforce its rules to properly analyze and attempt to remedy these issues of noncompliance, I think have paved the way for states to step up. Okay, second point here is that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is required to collect student borrower complaints, ended its practice of sharing these complaints with the Department of Education in 2017, which of course has naturally led to increased worry that there is not sufficient accountability for servicers if this information isn't shared with the Department of Education, who can then take action to regulate the servicers with whom they grant contracts to administer these loans. And finally, as I'm sure you are aware, there are several pending lawsuits, a couple of which are listed here that allege harmful mismanagement by servicers that led to poor borrowing outcomes for borrowers. I am not a lawyer, and so I will save myself from the embarrassment of citing case law or providing commentary as to how firm a legal footing either side is on here. But in short, the suit that you see the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau brought against Navient, which is of course one of the servicers that the Department of Education contracts with, alleges this sort of wrongdoing with borrowers. And the states that you see there listed are also in a suit against Navient for the same sort of practices. And those are the attorneys general from Mississippi, California, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Washington. So I guess just to recap very briefly, I think it's fair to say that these items have contributed to an environment in which states have felt compelled to step in and to provide additional oversight of servicers, and in that way, consumer protection for student loan borrowers. Next slide, please. Okay, so this increased oversight and consumer protection from states has come predominantly in the form of student borrower Bill of Rights laws. And I know that Seth Frotman showed you a similar map of states that have borrowers Bill of Rights laws in his presentation during your first meeting, but I just wanted to show this again quickly here. What I think is, especially noteworthy is that a majority of the states that you see here on this map enacted their BBOR law during the 2019 legislative session. And so there's certainly a good deal of momentum behind this concept as of late. And on the right, you have just a quick glimpse into what the Borrower Bill of Rights laws entail. And in short, it's about regulating servicers and protecting borrowers. And so in each state that you see there, the law either creates a new office of student loan ombudsman, or it designates someone to provide this consumer protection. And that office is charged with carrying out some of the duties that you see here. That is approving servicers, assisting borrowers, staying up to date on relevant policy change at the federal level, and analyzing complaints. And the last thing I'd say before moving on is that in most of the states that you see here, the servicer is required to obtain an operating license. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So here we have some of the specific provisions of the Borrower's Bill of Rights laws. And so here's just a quick chart that displays some of the prominent provisions in those laws. And, maybe before diving in, I wanted to make sure that I credit a report from the Center for Responsible Lending for providing this critical information. Most of my slides have a link for sources, and I wanted to make sure I point that out. At the bottom right hand side of the slide here, their report was incredibly helpful in putting this together for you all. And so now just to touch on some of these elements and what they mean in practice. So for licensing requirements, almost all of the laws require servicers to obtain a license to do business in the state. And so this includes an application process, an application fee, and an investigatory process that has to be renewed every 1 or 2 years, depending on the state. And so in short, the state has to conduct an investigation on the servicer and deem them eligible to operate in the state if they have a BBOR law in place. So for private right of action, again, I am no lawyer, but I do know that this ensures that individuals can bring a lawsuit against the servicer, which is, of course, an additional layer of accountability, I guess. And so every state that you see here, except for Connecticut, which was the first state to implement this sort of law in 2015, allows for that. And so when we move into prohibitive acts, the laws rather sort of outline basic acts that servicers cannot take up, such as knowingly mislead or defraud borrowers or inaccurately apply payments. And the affirmative duties take sort of the same shape in that they require servicers to provide timely responses to borrowers, applying payments as the borrowers would prefer, that sort of thing. And so both the prohibitive acts and the affirmative duties sort of provide baseline protections for borrowers and oversight for servicers. And finally, income-driven repayment before forbearance. You can see that Colorado, Maine, and New Jersey all require that servicers evaluate a borrower's eligibility and suitability for an income-driven repayment plan before placing them into forbearance. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, before moving on from BBOR, I wanted to provide a quick note on how the state regulatory authority in these laws has proven useful during the COVID-19 crisis. As you may know, and as you heard from Senator Baldwin this morning, actually, only the loans held by the Department of Education were covered by the federal stimulus package, the CARES Act. This left out, as you can see here on the chart from the Student Borrower Protection Center, more than $300 billion in student debt. However, 10 states were able to secure agreements with servicers who administer loans that are not covered by the CARES Act. And notably, 9 of those 10 states that reached agreements for private student loan debt have borrower's bill of rights laws in place. And what I can tell you in my conversations with state folks that reach these agreements, they have expressed that having the BBOR regulatory power was crucial in reaching these agreements. And so just a quick note on its utility, at least outside its original parameters and how it can step in. Next slide, please. Okay, finance. Okay, all right. Just to briefly set the stage here, when we talk about the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA, which I know came up during last week's session. The FAFSA, as mentioned last week, must be completed annually, determines eligibility for Wisconsin need-based aid, such as the Wisconsin grant, and it determines eligibility for any aid that institutions provide themselves. It, of course, also determines aid for federal loans and for federal grant aid as well. And so as you can see in the picture over there on the right, that is Senator Baldwin's colleague, Senator Lamar Alexander, who she mentioned chairs the Senate Education Committee, demonstrating just how complex the form is by unfurling a printed copy of it on the Senate floor. It's one of his favorite stunts, and everybody in the higher education community, I think, appreciates that. And so, as I'm sure you know, the form includes dozens of questions, some of which are relatively complex and require tax documents and information. And so I suppose that's, a long way of saying that there's a real need to support traditionally underrepresented students as they pursue higher ed and fill out the FAFSA. Next slide, please. So here's a quick look at the FAFSA completion rate in Wisconsin for the 2017-2018 academic year. You'll see here on this chart, which was put together by the National College Attainment Network, that Wisconsin ranked in the bottom half, 34th overall, with 54% of high school seniors completing the application. And so before diving into ways that other states have provided support to students filling application, I just wanted to provide that quick, just for context. Next slide, please. Okay. So one approach that states have taken, and I know that there were some questions about this during last week's meeting, is requiring high school seniors to complete the form in order to graduate high school. And so here is a quick chart of the 3 states that have implemented such a policy. Notably, Louisiana was the first state to do so in 2015, when the State Board of Ed amended the Secondary School Administrator Handbook. And so Texas and Illinois both passed legislation to the same effect last year. Now, that said, Louisiana is the only state that has seen implementation of the policy to date. And so as you can see here, in its first year under the new policy, they posted some great outcomes. They ranked #1 in FAFSA completion in the country. They set new state records for high school graduation rate and for the number of students that are enrolled in higher education directly out of high school. Now, some super important things to note here. As mentioned, Louisiana enacted this policy in 2015, and so it did not take effect for another 2 years. And so that allowed for a decent amount of time for the state to devote more resources and to support high school seniors completing the form. I will say out front, in my conversations with state leaders in Louisiana, it's been made pretty clear that preparation time and resources dedicated to student supports was absolutely crucial to achieving these outcomes. And so I guess that is to say that simply requiring the form to be completed and not devoting additional resources to student supports might not result in the desired outcome. And our team put together a memo on this policy intervention and the approach that Louisiana took with regards to support services. And so I'm happy to share that with their group more broadly. Now, lastly, on a separate issue, I should just note that there were some concerns about the requirement holding students back from graduating. And I can tell you that between my conversation with folks in Louisiana and the fact that the state posted its highest graduation rate ever, I have not seen any evidence yet that the new requirement kept anyone who would have otherwise graduated from receiving their diploma. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are a couple of non-legislative and non-regulatory state approaches to increasing FAFSA completion from 2 neighboring states. And in short, I think putting the governor's voice behind this issue is what can make an impact. And so first in Michigan, Governor Whitmer rolled out what's effectively a scoreboard for FAFSA completion so that each high school can track their progress and engage in a little bit of friendly competition after being challenged directly by the governor to increase their FAFSA completion rate. And in Ohio, Governor Mike DeWine declared October as FAFSA completion month in Ohio, with October 1st, of course, being when students can start filling out the FAFSA. That said, I know that Dr. Hutchison mentioned in her remarks last week that students who need financial aid the most are often unable to submit the FAFSA until later on in the application cycle. And that can lead to some students who are eligible for grant aid not receiving that aid. And so I think it's especially crucial to help students fill out the FAFSA as soon as possible. And that's sort of the idea behind Governor DeWine's approach in leveraging his platform. I should say that I also know that Dr. Hutchison mentioned the Higher Ed AIDS Board's effort to partner with the Department of Public Instruction and with WASFA to help support FAFSA completion. And so I just wanted to briefly, show ways that governors themselves have become involved in this important issue. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now, speaking of Dr. Hutchison's team at the Higher Ed AIDS Board, I was surprised to hear that it only takes a team of 10 to administer the financial aid programs that you see here in Wisconsin. Talk about small and mighty, I suppose. And so here are just the figures from the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs, or NASGAP survey from 2017 to 2018. I won't go through the formulas for each of the Wisconsin grants. I know Dr. Hutchison did that last week, but I figured that it might be helpful just to have these on hand and on the screen as a backdrop. As I briefly mentioned, I think sort of as Senator Baldwin did, the prospect of investing in need-based aid. Of course, one surefire way to ensure that students take on less debt is to offer more grant aid. And I'm of course aware that we find ourselves in a time in which budget constraints are already looming large and that there will be steep competition for state resources this upcoming budget cycle. But I don't know that it'd be appropriate to discuss debt without raising the point that there is always the option of investing in need-based aid programs to make college more affordable for students in the first place. Next slide, please. Okay. Next, we'll go ahead and talk about refinancing. And I know you'll be hearing from folks in Rhode Island about their program in depth, and so I'll do my best not to swerve into their lane too much. So briefly, I figured it'd be helpful to just give a quick look into what the interest rate on student loans has been in the recent past. And you'll notice that the line for unsubsidized loans ends in 2012-2013, and that's because of a law called the Student Loan Certainty Act, which was passed in 2013. And that law dictated that interest rates for all federal loans issued after July 1st of 2013 be set annually and based on the 10-year U.S. Treasury note. And it also calls for unsubsidized and subsidized loans to accrue at the same interest rate. So every year after that, interest rates for subsidized and unsubsidized student loans have been the same. And so I show you this chart just to illustrate why some policymakers have thought to allow greater access to refinancing programs for student loans. As you can see, as recently in 2006, the interest rate was 6.8% compared to the 2.75% interest rate that borrowers are now experiencing. Next slide, please. Okay. I'm seeing that I'm coming up close to time, and I do know that you will be hearing from the Rhode Island folks on the topic of refinancing. And so I will just leave this chart with you. It's a bit mind-numbing, but I think it just sort of outlines the program parameters for each of the states with a state-sponsored refinancing program, both across eligible loans, funding, any income requirements, the interest rates that are offered in these state financing programs, and other program eligibility requirements. I should mention the report at the bottom right, the Washington Institute for Public Policy was instrumental in putting together this chart. And so I will leave that with you and kind of leave the Rhode Island folks to cover refinancing in the interest of time. And so I just have, go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, this is just nexus requirements. We can go ahead and skip that slide. And then this is just some data on outcomes of refinancing programs. Next slide, please. Okay, now for the last policy topic before moving on to some example state programs. Our last topic being loan counseling. I think it's important to note here that federal statute and the regulatory code set the minimum requirements that institutions must carry out, and that any student that takes out a federal loan must receive entrance counseling before receiving their first disbursement and must undergo exit counseling before they exit their program, either after completion or upon stopping out of their program. That said, some states have employed additional measures to try and provide borrowers with better information about their student loans, and we'll go through that here in just a bit. And so here is just a little bit of data and context around the issue of loan counseling to hopefully demonstrate why some states have acted on this front. First, as you can see, a 2014 Brookings Institute study uncovered how some borrowers aren't fully aware of the terms of their loan when they sign on. And so according to the study, which did ask a nationally representative sample of first-year full-time students who borrowed about the terms of their loans. And about 47% of respondents underestimated the amount they borrowed by at least 20%, while 14% of borrowers were unaware that they had taken out a loan. Secondly, I'd go ahead and highlight the work of the Federal Reserve Board and the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, or NASPA. And I know we have Dr. Alfred on the line, and so before moving on to NASPA's work, I would just take a second to echo the sentiment from Dr. Hutchinson's remarks last week about the work that financial aid administrators do. It's especially crucial, and God knows how essential it is during the time of COVID-19 when families' financial situations and students' plans for the upcoming semester are changing almost overnight. So thank you, Dr. Alfred, for your work at WASFA. And of course, please chime in here with any thoughts about the NASPA report or the issue of loan counseling more broadly. And so the focus groups of financial aid administrators conducted by the Fed Board and NASPA found that the Department of Education's tool that lots of institutions use for loan counseling can be overwhelming and ineffective. And that the group of aid administrators also identified some of the practices they employ on their own campus to proactively reach out to student borrowers that they deem as, quote, at risk of default. The final point I'd make here is that in the last 3 congressional sessions, the House passed a loan counseling bill that would require institutions to annually update students on the terms of their loans, rather than just the entrance and exit counseling practices that are already in place. I should mention that the bill did pass with significant bipartisan support each of the 3 times it was brought to the floor in 2014, 2016, and 2018. But that said, it has not been taken on by the Senate. Next slide, please. Okay, now just to get into a couple of the policy solutions taken up by states in the last few years on the issue. There are essentially 2 practices that have been taken up, including by the state of Wisconsin, and these are, enhanced loan counseling practices to annually provide updates to borrowers on the terms of their loans, and the financial literacy programming enacted in 2017 in the state of Wisconsin. And so the final thing I would say on this slide before moving on is that the the statute for financial literacy programming simply just reads that the state should adopt, or quote, adopt academic standards for financial literacy and incorporate instruction in financial literacy into the curriculum in grades kindergarten through 12. And so it might be worth exploring how that's been implemented and if there are better ways to ensure that borrowers make informed choices. Next slide, please. Okay, just a few things to consider on loan counseling before we move on to the state programs, and I will be very quick. I've dropped a couple of what I think are key questions just to keep in mind for anyone that's pursuing this strategy to help borrowers. First, for enhanced counseling, I think it's important to identify the goal of the policy, and that might be obvious, but some research does show that the wrong approach to providing students with this information, with increased information, can lead to less borrowing and also poor academic outcomes. And so ultimately, there's a delicate balance to strike between making sure that students are fully aware of the debt load that they are taking on and scaring students into not equipping themselves with the resources that they need to complete their program. And secondly, with financial literacy programs, I just dropped in a couple of things to consider around the broader college-going culture and curricula as you take a look at the way that the 2017 law was implemented. Next slide, please. Okay, now just moving on to state spotlights. I have a handful of programs here that are aimed at providing debt relief to borrowers through various means. And again, I just want to reiterate that my goal here is not to offer up these examples in hopes that you select one of them or duplicate one of them, but rather I hope that they offer different ideas that might help shape a solution that's best for Wisconsin. Okay, so first we have New York's Get On Your Feet. And the goal of this program is to help borrowers who graduated high school and college in the state of New York who are making $50,000 to get on your feet, so to speak, by providing repayment assistance for eligible borrowers. And so this is, as you can see, by the requirements that applicants be no more than 2 years removed from college graduation, and then that it's aimed at those who just completed their program. Borrowers also must be enrolled in an income-driven repayment plan for which they would put 10% of their monthly income towards repayment. And of course, would be covered by the state. And there are also some pretty strong nexus requirements there as far as connectivity to the state. And so they require that you live, work, and have graduated from high school and college from New York to be eligible. Next slide, please. Okay. Next is a significantly different approach taken by the state of Connecticut. And this was enacted last year. The bill provides a tax credit to employers who assist employees in student loan repayment. And as you can see, when the law goes into effect in 2 years, employers can receive a tax credit for half of the amount that they contribute to employee loan repayment assistance. And again, there is a nexus requirement that an employee be a Connecticut resident, and they also must have completed their bachelor's degree within the last 5 years and have refinanced their loan through the state. And so again, a pretty complex eligibility parameters there, but an interesting and nuanced approach that might not exactly make for broad repayment assistance for employees, but it might be a concept worth exploring. And I've also posted here that a Connecticut employer will begin this practice starting this year, and that some surveys of employers have found that there's an increasing amount of interest for this type of assistance. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm sure you all will cover debt relief offered to student borrower in the stimulus package, as we sort of did this morning, more in depth at some point, but I did want to make sure that I covered this aspect of the CARES Act briefly as it relates to tax credits for employers. So the CARES Act does amend the tax code to allow for employers to contribute up to $5,250 per year to an employee for student loan payments. And this assistance, I should note, of course, will not be subject to payroll tax for the employer and will not be subject to income tax for the employee. And so that said, there's a federal benefit already out there to be, to maybe worth thinking over the opportunity to market this program in Wisconsin or to leverage this new federal resource that could provide meaningful help student borrowers. Next slide, please. Okay, here we have another tax credit approach, this time for borrowers themselves as opposed to employers in the state of Kansas. And the approach, as you see here, has sort of two prongs and two objectives to it. The stated goal of the policy, which was enacted in 2012, is to reduce the number of individuals leaving the state's rural communities and incentivize them to move into the communities to work, live, and of course pay taxes. The incentives provided by the state are, again, twofold, and that being that student debt assistance and an income tax waiver, and I'll focus on the student debt part of it. And so to be eligible, each borrower must be sponsored by either the county or their employer. And sponsorship, of course, in this case, meaning that that party matched the loan assistance provided by the state on a dollar-for-dollar basis. You see some eligibility parameters there of $3,000 a year for 5 years, or 20% of the balance for borrowers of less than $15,000 in debt. And so that's another way that that tax credits are used, but this time to provide assistance directly to borrowers. Next slide, please. Okay. So in 2017, Maryland enacted changes to their tax code and began allowing borrowers who accrued at least $20,000 in debt to apply for a tax credit. Applicants must submit documentation such as transcripts and proof of their status as a student borrower in order to be considered for the tax credit. And also those who attended an institution in the state of Maryland do get preference for this. And in 2018, an accompanying executive order issued by Governor Hogan outlined additional elements that will allow participants to receive preference. And that, as you can see, are for people working in fields in which there is a current workforce shortage. And so here I also have some data on who received the tax credit on its first year of operation. And so as you can see, they gave the Department of Higher Education a decent amount of flexibility with regards to who gets the tax credit and how much. And then I finally have the 2019 legislative proposal on allowing taxpayers to deduct the full amount of interest that they paid on a student loan in a fiscal year. And that program does come with an income cap, and I should mention it did not pass. I should have that in text on the slide, but that program did not pass in the state of Maryland. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, my last program. I'll be quick. So here's an example of a state with, sort of a first-class data collection process. And so before highlighting Virginia here, I just wanted to, give a nod to Dr. Hillman's presentation and to the series of interactive data tools that he put together on student loan debt in Wisconsin last month. I know that they were helpful in putting together my presentation, and I'm confident that they'll be helpful in your efforts moving forward. The short way of highlighting Virginia's data collection process is that it's worth considering an investment in data collection processes to fully understand the scope of student debt in the state. Right now, we can piece together, different federal data sources, different credit reporting data sources to get the best possible portrait that we can. But it could be in the interest of the state to pursue this. Next slide, please. Okay, issues to consider moving forward. This is my last slide before we go into Q&A, and I just figured it might be helpful to leave you all some final thoughts and next steps to consider, and I promise to be brief. The first item I have here is a suggestion that whichever policy intervention you all take up, I encourage you to keep in mind, or at least, or maybe even in the center of your thinking, the critical question of whether or not this policy helps borrowers who need the most help. I know full well that state resources are precious, especially right now, and so I think it's critical to ensure that taxpayer dollars, are allocated to borrowers who need the most help. Okay, secondly, I would just reiterate that I hope that the programs and policy concepts that I showcased today help inspire ideas for a policy intervention or a program that's best for Wisconsin. And what I mean by that is, when you're targeting resources to help student borrowers, there are program designs and eligibility parameters to consider, such as the ones we saw today of targeting borrowers who have a low income or who are working in public service or in an industry that Wisconsin needs more workers. You can do it by geographic location like Kansas. And there are also eligibility parameters that need to be considered. And so, those eligibility parameters need to be coupled with, what's the best solution? Is it empowering them with information? Is it more consumer protections, providing with a tax credit or loan assistance? And so I encourage you all to think of it as like a puzzle to try and put together with, the different, hopefully, programs that might have been helpful to think through that today. Okay, lastly, a final suggestion of to keep your eye towards October 1st. This is when the federal grace period for federal student loans included in the COVID-19 stimulus package is set to expire. This is what Senator Baldwin was talking about this morning. And so that is when students with federal loans will have to resume making payments. And the unfortunate reality is that many of them will be worse off financially than when the federal grace period began in March. And so you may want to consider short-term policy interventions that do things like help individuals navigate their borrowing experience and choose a path forward that is best for them. And as we heard from Senator Baldwin earlier, there may be more to come on this front. And so there may be an opportunity for you all to engage on the next round of stimulus in some capacity. I'm not sure what the constraints might be as far as what the task force is able to take up. But as these things are debated in Congress, I think that, the task force could play some sort of role in shaping the approach that the Wisconsin delegation takes to those negotiations. Lastly, I would just say, please don't hesitate to reach out. I have provided Marco a few memos and other research on some of the topics that I touched on today. So if there's any policy or program for which you'd like more detail, I am more than happy to serve as a resource for the task force. And I think with that, my next slide is just a backdrop for Q&A, and so we can go ahead and dive into that. Boy.
Thank you very much for your time and knowledge and sharing that with the task force members today. A few questions have come in and even responses to the chat, so I'll try and summarize some of those for you in the next 10 minutes or so that we have time for questions. So again, if any task force members do have questions, please submit them using the chat to everybody. And if there are questions from public attendees, we'll be sure to follow on those after the meeting. But in direct context of what you just talked about as your second to last bullet, one broad question is, with the current deferment of federal loan programs until the end of September for the interest-driven, is the federal government going to delay recertification of income, or do you have any information in regards to that?
So this is for income-driven repayment, I assume. So it's tricky because folks' income is changing rapidly, and I do believe the Department of Education provided guidance on this issue. I don't think that it was written into law, and of course law is, that carries more weight than a regulation from the Department of Ed, but I'm going to make a note to myself here to follow up with the group on what guidance, if any, came from the Department of Ed for recertifying income. I don't want to spend too much time pondering it, but I believe that it either in one way or another, either in the CARES Act or through guidance from the Department of Education, that issue was taken up. That issue being ensuring that students can remain in their income-driven repayment plan. Sorry for not having an immediate answer on that.
No, that's great. We appreciate your following up with that information. One of the questions that came up that task force members with their expertise and knowledge contributed responses to is, what is the Wisconsin deadline for FAFSA? And some responses were that it's the end of the term in which the student had enrolled, and the earlier you fill out the form, the more likely they are to receive state funds. But there's also more information in the chat if people would like to review that or review that post-meeting as it relates to the more specific time timing and information for that as well. But a question back to you, and certainly enhance my response and all the task force members with the timing of FAFSA, but is a borrower bill of rights something you suggest for Wisconsin?
So I will say that, as policy, the National Governors Association does not make policy recommendations to states. But that said, I can speak in a personal capacity. And what I would say is that, I would go back to the slide on the private debt issue. There's been, I think the primary criticism of the Borrower Bill of Rights laws is that it's additional compliance and what have you. But we've already seen, the utility of the state regulating the servicers that are operating and doing business in their state and providing and administering federal loans. And that being that because these states had the regulatory authority and that hook with the servicers, that they were able to provide critical student debt relief to borrowers who were not covered under the CARES Act. And that's critical. Like I said, there's $300 billion in student debt that's not covered by the federal stimulus package. And, less than a year or two out from most of these laws being enacted, there's already proven to be utility outside of the, baseline oversight and consumer protections. The only thing that I would add is that because they are so new, there are not outcomes of, that we can point to on Borrower's Bill of Rights laws as far as a slam dunk positive outcome for these policies, aside from, the private debt relief. But as far as its original scope, there are not positive outcomes to point to. That's not to say that there won't be, but it's just early on in the process. And I would also say that, these laws have evolved over time. And that's over a short period of time, but they have evolved. Connecticut was the first to implement such a law in 2015, and so their law is a little bit different than the folks that enacted in 2016, 2017. And like I said, half of the states that have a law in place enacted it in 2019. And so there are provisions that I think can be considered outside of what have already been enacted in some of these laws. And so there's all sorts of latitude and opportunity, I think, to do what is best for Wisconsin borrowers. And so, I think that, I guess that's a long way of saying it's worth looking into, and it is undoubtedly worth considering. And there is that ability to be creative and innovative and do things that states have not done yet on this front, whether that's increased data collection or what have you. But I think that providing, these consumer protections and oversight of servicers is critical. And so it's a long way of saying it's a worthy goal, and I would say that it is worth pursuing, yes.
Thank you for that in expanding your response to your own thoughts as well. I want to mention to all task force members in the chat, Representative Baldwin did provide a link related to the Wisconsin Act 284 and that memo and summary there that was referenced during the presentation. So that link is there, and we'll be sure to move that forward as well. So another question to you is, has there been any research done to see how lenders not covered under the CARES Act have responded to borrowers? And an example provided is that the UW Credit Union extended payment relief to their borrowers prior to the effective date of the CARES Act. So if you have any information in relation to that question.
I do, yes. What I can say is that the trade association for the lenders publicly supported providing debt relief, and so it's been a positive response on the whole. from, from lenders, aside from the Department of Education. So from lenders who hold loans not covered under CARES. And so I applaud those efforts, and they have been extremely collaborative with states looking to secure private debt relief. And so, that's just, I guess a long way of saying that it's been a positive development, and the parent company or the trade association, for the lenders that hold these privately held loans have been understanding and have been willing to bend and provide borrowers with short-term relief, like you said, Michelle, even before the CARES Act was implemented. And so I can send along their public statement and be sure to monitor any updates that they provide for their borrowers.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we'll, as we discussed prior to your presenting, send off some of the additional questions that came in and try and seek your responses to those so we can share that with task force members as well. So in this final minute, any last thoughts or wishes you wish to pass forward to the task force? And then we'll move to our break.
Yes, first I would thank you, Michelle, for helping me put this together. I would thank you, Secretary Blumenfeld, for the invitation, and of course, Marco and Cody for helping getting me plugged in today. What I can do is go ahead and jump into the chat box here and maybe respond directly to some of the questions and comments that I've seen popping up, just so that I at least provide an initial response, and I can do more in depth if you'd like. But the only thing that I would say in closing would be to think creatively, like Senator Baldwin said, and that there's opportunity, not just with the Borrower Bill of Rights, but to think innovatively and to pull on some of the different policy levers that I highlighted in states' policy interventions today to design something that's best for Wisconsin. And of course, federal negotiations coming up is a unique way to do so. And so, thank you, and I, of course, look forward to following up in any capacity that you would like. Thank you, everybody.
Well, again, thank you to you for your time, knowledge, and expertise in this area. And at this point in time, we will move to our break. It is an 8-minute break, so very precise time here today. So we'll reconvene at 11:44 and move forward with our next presentation. Just letting everyone know we have 1 minute remaining in our break, and then we will get started with the introductions of our next presenters. Thank you, everyone. It's now 11:44. We will proceed with our next presentations, and I'll turn the mic over for introductions to our chair, Secretary Blumenfeld.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and welcome back from break number 1. We're very excited to have here today Seth Magaziner, Treasurer of Rhode Island. So as Rhode Island's treasurer, Seth is working to expand economic activity and financial stability for all Rhode Islanders. Seth began his career as a public elementary school teacher and later as an investment professional before taking on the office of Rhode Island's general treasurer in 2015. As the treasurer, Seth is committed to helping families save for higher education and advocating financial literacy as well as access to affordable financial services for Rhode Island. Today, we will learn about one such program, the Rhode Island Student Loan Authority, or RISLA. So with that, I'll welcome Treasurer Seth Magaziner.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Blumenfeld. Thank you to all of the members of the committee for the warm welcome and the invitation to speak. My name is Seth Magaziner. I'm the State Treasurer of Rhode Island. I want to commend all of you for focusing on this very important topic. I also have to give a special shout out to my friend and colleague, Treasurer Godlewski. I don't know if she's watching or not, but I know that she has made student loan affordability a priority of hers and something that she has been talking about for a number of years now. You've got a really good state treasurer. She, among all the other treasurers in the country, she is well known and very well respected. So as was said earlier, I'm proud of the work that we're doing in Rhode Island on student loans because this is an issue that affects so many people, millions of Americans, thousands of Rhode Islanders, I'm sure thousands of Wisconsinites are struggling with a student loan burden that is frankly unsustainable. And these are men and women who have been told, including many that come from modest backgrounds, told that education is the key to success, that if they work hard, they do well in school, they go to college, that's how they will achieve economic opportunity, and that is how they'll be able to build wealth and have a share of the American dream. And unfortunately, the reality for many people is they do the right thing. They work hard, they go to school, they go to college, they work their butts off to get there, they graduate, and right away they are burdened with hundreds of dollars a month in loan costs that make it very hard for them to get established, to build wealth, and to achieve that dream. And so as policymakers, it's incumbent on us to do everything that we can to make it as easy as possible for all Americans to be able to not only access higher education, but access it on terms that are affordable. I guess we're here primarily to talk about the work of the Rhode Island Student Loan Authority, and I'm joined by Charles Kelly, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Student Loan Authority, who will give the bulk of our presentation for us. RISLA is an agency that we're very proud of in Rhode Island. It is a lender and a refinancer and a servicer of student loans. It is a quasi-public agency that has bonding authority, so it can bond on a tax-exempt basis under the state's tax-exempt bonding authority, and can then lend out the proceeds to those Rhode Islanders who are seeking higher education. So the low cost of capital that RISLA has access to through tax-exempt borrowing can be used to offer very low and very competitive rates to borrowers. And of course, the fact that as a quasi-public agency, RISLA is not looking to make a profit. RISLA is devoted entirely to serving the mission of providing affordable financing for higher education to students. That also allows them to be very competitive from a cost point of view. I will leave it to Charlie to give you all of the details, but I will just say at the outset, and I should clarify, as state treasurer, I serve on the board of RISLA, and Charlie and I work very closely together. One other thing that we have done in Rhode Island that I know was a topic that I think I heard earlier in the meeting that I'd also be happy to talk about and answer questions is we did pass a student loan bill of rights last year in Rhode Island that provides protections to borrowers from some of the more problematic student loan servicing practices that are out there. And I'd be happy to talk about some of the protections that we put into place under state law in Rhode Island. But perhaps it makes sense for me to start by handing it over to Charlie to talk about the Rhode Island Student Loan Authority, since that is the main topic that you invited us to discuss. And I also want to be sensitive to his time as well. And then if there's time at the end, I can take a few minutes and talk about our student loan bill of rights as well, if that's okay with you. So with that, turn it over to Charles Kelly, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Student Loan Authority.
Can you hear me? Can anyone hear?
We can hear you.
All right. I will pull up my presentation. This is Charlie Kelly, and thank you, Mr. Treasurer, for the great introduction. The Treasurer has really been the one to spearhead the Student Loan Bill of Rights in Rhode Island and other protections and initiatives, including financial literacy. And we're going to touch upon many of these this afternoon. And I'd also like to commend Mr. Porter, particularly if he's still on the line, for a great presentation. And it was a great lead-in for many of the topics that I'm going to talk about today. So let us get started. As the Treasurer mentioned, we're a nonprofit quasi-state agency founded in 1981. And we're providing not just education loans, but education services that help students and families achieve their higher education aspirations. And I've been involved in doing that with the authority for about 29 years, and it has been just a very great experience to be able to help people and use my background for that. So as I mentioned, the authority's role provides education loans, and most of those loans are for middle-income families with students going to traditional schools or some certificate training programs. Those students with need, really, we try to direct them towards Pell Grants, SEOG, the work study, institutional aid, state aid, things of that nature. They shouldn't really be taking on large amounts of debt, given perhaps their family situations. Then we also do refinancing loans, which we'll talk about later, which I think is maybe of particular interest to the group today. And then, as the Treasurer mentioned, as a quasi-state agency, sort of the dividends that we pay out are back to the community. In the terms of sponsoring our college planning center, nursing rewards program involving our loans, financial literacy outreach, scholarships to encourage financial literacy, and most recently we're involved in the employer loan repayment assistance program, which Mr. Porter spoke about and that we're very excited about. So again, what we do is provide the counseling, planning for people in the high school years. Then if they need financing or just to fill out applications, and then we're evolving into the employer repayment world. We started our college planning center with a small kiosk in the Warwick Mall, and we've graduated, you might say, to a larger facility there and another one in Rhode Island. And with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're still operating, including nights and weekends where needed, but doing it all telephonically. So people can go and book an appointment on our website to book a telephone call with one of our experienced counselors. The treasurer also mentioned servicing, which is very important, in which the Student Loan Bill of Rights that he championed addresses very well. We too, I think, attribute a great deal of our success over the years to good customer service. And to achieve that, we brought in our loan origination and underwriting services in-house using our own proprietary software, which we've developed over the years. And then an interesting coincidence, for 10 years now, we have been using remotely the servicing platform provided by a University Accounting Service from Brookfield, Wisconsin. And of course, I had to go out there and do our due diligence about their facility and security, and was able to happily sample some of those cheese curds, which were quite good. So the in-school loan programs, and I emphasize the in-school loan programs right now, are all fixed rate. And usually the parent is or sponsor is a co-signer with the student, because since we finance these loans through bond issues, which are not an obligation of the state, we have to adhere to credit criteria established in concert with the bond rating agencies. But we feel, particularly at this time at low interest rates, that the safest thing is to offer fixed rate loans. It protects the borrower from monthly payment increases should interest rates increase. And our rates have traditionally been much less expensive than Sallie Mae or other for-profit lenders, and even the federal government. So we just closed on our bond issue last week, and these are the latest rates that we're offering. And again, even when the Stafford loan rates that students take out were higher than ours, we still encouraged, really demanded that students first look to the federal loan program to borrow what they need. And for freshmen, that's a maximum of $5,500 for most students. And then it's really the families, when they need additional resources beyond what the student loan can supply, then it's programs like ours that they should look at. And we do have borrower protections, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but it also includes an income-based repayment program. Now, most people don't believe it, but state-based programs are frequently less expensive than the federal parent loan, the PLUS loan. And for the rates that we paid this year, which were probably higher because of the pandemic than normal, we'll still save, if someone borrows about $20,000 to pay a bill at a school, we'll probably still save them $2,400 approximately over the typical 10-year repayment period. So state-based programs, not just ours, but many of them, really help save a certain segment of the population a great deal of money. And most parents, are not going to enjoy the same benefits that a student borrower taking out a Stafford loan would be able to realize. So the trade-off is not that big in terms of federal benefits. Oh dear, sorry about this. So refinancing, which I saw on your agenda, is something that may be of interest. 4 years ago, we started our refinancing program, which I believe was the first in the country to do this. And so far, even though we've loaned out approximately $200 million in refinancing loans, we've had only 3 people default. And again, these loans are originated and serviced in-house by Risler in Rhode Island. And the borrower protections I referred to earlier include forbearances, where somebody might have a temporary medical or employment, financial issue. We will suspend the payments for up to 12 months. Now, the interest does accrue, but bondholders, that's one of the limitations you encounter when you're financing these with bond issues. We also have an income-based repayment program we've been using for years, and it's been very successful. So if somebody's difficulties go beyond a typical 12-month period, we provide an income-based repayment program that's very similar to what the federal government's initial income-based repayment program is. And after 25 years, if they have not paid off the loan and have been in that program, we will forgive the balance. Also, Risler does not charge any origination fees either on the refinancing loans or for its in-school loans. And this was the bond issue we closed on last week, and it's for about $100 million. And really, I have this here to point out two things. Tax-exempt funding is clearly available for in-school loans. It is less clear for refinancing loans. So we also did a portion of the bond issue using taxable funds. We've taken a very conservative approach so as not to run afoul of anything with the Treasury or the IRS. However, as the Treasurer pointed out, the funding costs are slightly higher when you do taxable funding than it does for the tax exempt. Now, again, if perhaps Wisconsin is considering a refinancing program for its state, one of the big hurdles to get over is the required over-collateralization, meaning that the rating agencies will subject your proposal to stressful cash flows, and it will involve trying to see if there are high defaults, whether the bondholders still get paid. Now, that can be mitigated with subordinate bonds and cash, but for a $10 million issue, just for numbers, you may have to put in $2 million of cash up front to get that ranked. Now, some states do provide moral obligation, but that is less the case than usual. And I'll just quickly go down, given the interest of time. We do have a scholarship fund that we do to promote financial literacy, and we work very closely with Treasurer Magazina's office on coordinating financial literacy efforts within the state. And as Mr. Porter mentioned, the CARES Act included making employer repayment tax exempt for the employee. So while it is only through the end of this year, it has generated a great deal of interest. We built the software to do this last year, and we're currently in discussions with a couple of New England states of working with them, providing our software to them so they can offer that to employers in their state, and we would run the program for them. So when we go to an employer, we provide college savings plan for employees that have young children, college planning services for those in high school, financial wellness for everyone, and refinancing for those employees, whether they be their own student loans or whether loans that the parents may have taken out to pay for their college education. And this is basically how the program works. And I won't bore you with the details, but we essentially make it simple for an employer to offer this service at a very affordable fee. And then we'll take care of the administrative back office work of getting the money and the electronic rosters to the services to be applied to the loan that the employee designated that they wanted to pay off. So we've done very well over the years, but there's always been different things that we've tried and may not have worked. And one of them is we had an internship matching service, and it did actually work for several years, but we didn't ramp it up to keep up with technology just because we don't have that many schools in Rhode Island, and we just didn't see having the sufficient scale to do it. And the other one I'll point out is credit-based pricing. We do that for our refinancing loans because you have to offer, to be competitive in the marketing of it, a as low as rate that looks as good as the for-profit lenders. But it's something that we don't like because we prefer to be just very transparent, but it's one of the challenges that you have to deal with. So I know I've gone through this very quickly, but I'll leave up a contact information here for all of you. And please feel free to reach out or to any of the other individuals mentioned here. And we have a national organization that I served as chair for many years on, called the Education Finance Council in DC. And one of our goals is try to encourage more states to become involved in providing college planning, financial literacy, and education loan programs that are favorable for the residents of those states. So with that, I will turn it back over to the treasurer. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Charlie. If I could, I'll just take 2 minutes and explain how our Student Loan Bill of Rights works. And then I think Charlie and I are both happy to take questions on either topic. The Student Loan Bill of Rights in Rhode Island has more to do with the student loan servicing space. As you all are most likely familiar, the servicers are tasked with processing loan payments and with keeping borrowers educated about their repayment options. Unfortunately, the interests between the servicers and the borrowers are not always aligned. And because of that misalignment of incentives or at times just through neglect, student loan borrowers are not given adequate servicing. And there are far too many stories of borrowers who, like for those of us who are homeowners, this doesn't happen very often with mortgage servicing. With mortgage servicing, you don't think about it very often. The same amount of money comes out of your bank account every month and you don't really have to worry about it. But unfortunately, in the student loan space, there are far too many stories of student loan borrowers where their servicers will draw the wrong amount, or all of a sudden 1 month they'll get their payment drawn twice or not at all. There'll be inaccurate information about the repayment history of the borrower being sent to credit score agencies. And, in some egregious cases, servicers making it difficult for borrowers to access loan assistance programs that they are legally entitled to. I'll give just one example. For federal student loan borrowers who are eligible for public service loan forgiveness, under federal law, the way it's supposed to work is that after 120 payments, the remaining balance of a loan is supposed to be forgiven for those who work for government or for a nonprofit organization. And when that program launched, after the first 10 years, when the first cohort of borrowers became eligible for loan forgiveness and went to their servicer and said, hey, we're ready for our forgiveness, the rejection rate was 99.5%, often because the servicer had messed something up, had drawn the wrong amount, or who had failed to draw an amount 1 month. And keep in mind, the servicer stops getting paid if the loan is forgiven. So again, there's a misaligned incentive there to help people get the loan forgiveness that they're entitled to. And when people would run into these problems, borrowers, they would be told something like, oh, well, we'll review your case. We're going to put you in an appeals process. It can take a couple of years. We recommend that you keep making your payments in the meantime. And people plan their lives around this. When to have kids, when to buy a house was all timed around loan forgiveness for public servants. And so that's just one of many examples of some of the flaws in the student loan servicing industry that we were attempting to correct. So the Student Loan Bill of Rights in Rhode Island was essentially a consumer protection bill where we put into state law a number of standards for student loan servicing. And some of it is really basic stuff. Like if you are a loan servicer, you have to give people accurate information about their progress toward repayment. You have to draw the right amounts from their account every month. You have to give accurate information to the credit bureaus. We also require the servicers to no less than once a year proactively reach out to borrowers, tell them what their progress toward repayment is, and inform them of all loan assistance programs that they are eligible for, whether it's income-driven repayment, public service loan forgiveness, or anything else. And if a servicer fails to abide by these standards, then our Attorney General and our Department of Business Regulation have the authority to investigate complaints from borrowers. And if the servicer is found to be in the wrong, they are empowered to levy fines against the servicers and seek financial restitution for the victims. So that in a nutshell is the law we passed. It is similar to student loan bill of rights laws that have been passed elsewhere in the country. Ours is a little bit different because we did not use a licensing regime. We don't have any requirement that a servicer has to be licensed to operate in Rhode Island. And that's an important distinction because when these laws have been challenged in the courts in other states, it's typically the licensing requirement that has tripped up the states, at least as far as federal student loan servicers are concerned. So we don't have a licensing requirement in Rhode Island, but we do have requirements for standards for the servicing of loans, and then the ability to investigate and issue penalties for violation of those practices. So I will stop there, and I thank you for giving me a chance to get a plug in for that initiative as well, in addition to the great work that's being done at the Student Loan Authority. And I think at this point, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your time and sharing the information. We have a number of questions that are very specific to the program that I think we will send your way for written response so we can share that with everyone in that concept. But just to throw one out in the interest of the time that you've given us today, are you refinancing applicants with lower credit profiles that commercial lenders would likely not approve? And what percentage of refinance applications that you receive are approved and taken by the applicant?
Oh, Charlie, I think you're on mute.
Okay. This is Charlie Kelly. We do go down to a 680 minimum FICO score. And I don't know how that compares to commercial lenders. They keep that very private. But you cannot really go below certain levels, and the rating agencies would still give you a good rating because they do track default rates by FICO band when we're having our bonds rated. And probably about 70% of the people that initially apply with us will follow through, get approved, and take out our loans.
Thank you. And as I mentioned, a lot of these questions are very specific details with the program, and I know there is great interest. So we will send these to you in written form for response if we could. And at this point in time, in the interest of our time and wanting to move to our breakout sessions today, which we're very excited to have the exchange, I will thank you both for your time and expertise in sharing with us, and thank you in advance for the follow-up that we will do in seeking responses to the questions that the task force members have had here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So with that, all members will be moving, well, not all members, one set of members will be remaining in the main room as we take a break and ask you to move to your breakout room for a facilitated discussion. And we have identified 4 facilitators from our task force members to lead these discussions. And then we're going to come back to this main room for a report out conversation. So So you can see here on this slide what room you should be moving to. And the links to the breakout rooms are in the chat session. So please open your chat box and click on the link that you need to move to for your room. And then if you are on the phone and want to join a different breakout room than the main room, or if you're a public attendee, that information is available on the public notice, so you could move there as well. But we will mute the mics, ask that people move to their rooms using those links. And please try and enter those rooms by 12:19, so we can have 20 minutes of discussion. At 12:39, we'll move back to this main room and have that report out for the concluding part of our meeting. So try and refill that coffee and change rooms. Thank you very much. Just a 1-minute reminder that we'll come back from break in 1 minute. And if you have not already opened up and moved to your breakout room, this would be the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Hello, breakout meeting room 1 people. Welcome. We had the easy job, right? Because we didn't have to go to another, a different room. So it's great to be with you, and I'm sure you're all anxious to talk and share your ideas. So this is just a more intimate way, virtually, of course, for us to get together. I will facilitate this part of it. Catherine Haberland, who's our assistant deputy at DFI, will be the scribe. And so she will be using the chat feature here to kind of take note of our ideas. And then when we come back to the full group, I'll do a quick report out with the benefit of having all those great notes. So the first question I have, and I think we'll try just letting people kind of move around the room virtually to share their ideas. But based on what you've heard in the first 3 meetings, what do you believe are the problems and issues related to student debt that require change? So I'm gonna just chat this on the side here so that you can see the actual question. And I'm gonna put the second question in as well, because the follow-up will be based on what we hear, where you believe there are ideas that have been shared, or, you know, based on your own expertise, issues, ideas that you have to help address some of these options or these issues. So let's start with number 1. And I won't call on people at first. Let's see if we can do it a little free form. And if not, if you want to raise your hand, that's great. And for those that are in the task force, it'd be great if you could turn your cameras on if possible. And if you want to raise your hand, that's great. That's an easy way to look. I saw it was a Karen. Maybe if you want to start out, that would be great. So question number 1.
I was really taken and struck by the lack of good information for student loan borrowers, right? A lot of the issues that the people who gave their personal stories talked about were just based on them not having enough or accurate information from their student loan servicers. So I see that as a major problem.
Thank you. So not having, there's a lot of information out there, but not having it when they need it and when they're making those really important decisions in their life.
Right.
Very good.
Both at inception and once they're in repayment.
Jeff, I saw you raise your hand.
I would add to that. I think it starts, from the UW systems perspective. Once a student enters school, are we giving them the information they need to access the help that is out there properly? I think there's a lot of confusion about the qualifications for certain repayment programs, but one of the things I know the legislature has kind of directed us to do is share a bunch of information up front about student debt and financial, the financial ramifications of student debt. But I think a more robust advising atmosphere for a freshman in college who's never taken out a student loan in his or her life, and making sure they understand, here are the ramifications of it. Also, here are your options for repayment. Here are your options for other financial aid. I had somebody reach out to me this week from a private company who set up a pretty robust scholarship fund that's just not being used. So I'm frantically sending information to student affairs officers, like, get students to apply for this money. There's money there. And I think there's a lot of that too. So I think just in terms of making sure students understand what's available and how best to process it would be helpful starting right away as freshmen. And that's something that's on us to do, but that will require resources. But I think that's an important step.
Very good. Thank you. And Michael? I think you're on mute, Michael. There. Now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I had two things that struck me. One is the cost of loans. I have a number of colleagues or former colleagues at Milwaukee Area Technical College who are faculty who took out loans at pretty high rates when they were high rates. They pay on them monthly and the loan never goes down. So I think the issue of refinancing loans is particularly at lower rates is particularly salient and something that needs to be looked at. But the other is based on my experience, and it was mentioned in the first session, a disproportionate amount of defaults are associated with students who have attended for-profit colleges or institutions, particularly a disproportionate number of defaults. And my experience, both with students who were marketed into attending those schools, is that they signed up for loans. They had no idea. They were told, oh, don't worry about it, sign these papers. And I think that the need to have pretty rigorous regulation for-profit schools around that is imperative. We have lots of students at MATC and other technical colleges who use up a lot of their potential financial aid and end up way in debt from attending those schools. And I know the Education Accountability Board has also got some responsibility, so I don't know how what we're doing and that fit together.
Thank you very much. Let's see, Jamie Miller?
Yes. Yeah, my concern, I mean, the federal student loans, there's so many options for repayment through IBR and other federal programs. I really see in my law practice and my bankruptcy practice that it's the private student loans that are really causing the most stress for people, because having a private student loan is like having a huge credit card debt that they just don't know how to manage. And I'm not sure how we can address that. But for those low income people or people that are struggling paying back their debt, the federal loans through IBR, that program, as long as people are educated on it, they're doing great. Just the private student loans, there doesn't seem to be an outlet for that.
Very good, thank you. Representative Vaughn.
I was wondering if we could follow up with, do we need to have an extension of the Wisconsin FAFSA deadline, as was maybe done in some states? That the deadline is the 30th of this month, but obviously there's a lot of students and prospective higher ed students that aren't engaged right now. So how do we go about finding them to remind them to do that? And I really like the looking forward, the Ohio program in making that a emphasis. So that's something that either the department or treasurer of the governor's office could put together in cooperation with higher ed and the legislature to push out that information. So I think those are a couple good things to move forward on.
Yeah, short-term solutions too that we could act on. Derek Campbell.
Hi, everyone. again, I don't want to reiterate too much about what's been said already, but I thought that one, based on the borrower speakers that we've had thus far, as well as my own experience, kind of to Jeff's point, some of that front end information, as well as financial literacy information, I think is really important. A lot of those amounts of money and different options available to people. Personally, I didn't really take as good of a look at until it was rather far along in my college career. I also thought it was interesting what Jack mentioned. He pointed to a statistic that a good amount of students, when polled, underestimated how much they actually had borrowed until that point, which I think kind of speaks to that not being as engaged and knowledgeable of the loans that are taken out on the front end. And then I think on the back end, the ability to refinance, as well as those other consumer protection laws that have been mentioned and recommended thus far, I think would be super important and helpful to look at.
Great, thank you, Derek. Renee, are you on? Or Sylvie? I'm not sure if they made it in our breakout room or not. Well, good.
Hi, everyone. Can you
Great.
hear me?
Hi, Sylvie. Yep, we can hear you now.
Hi. I think what it really comes down to is financial literacy, knowledge, and awareness. A lot of students, especially coming from the high school setting, where even at the ripe young age of are being kind of thrown or thrusted into the higher education realm with all of this new information, yet not enough of how to process it, or even not enough of how to find it. Typically what I see at work, in the financial aid office, is we have students coming in with just wanting to have their goals attained, focus, the degree, the whole realm of that, which is great. But then they're just told, complete a FAFSA, sign on the dotted line, and carry about your way, not understanding the full ramifications of what's going to happen in years to come, or even after they graduate, for upon them signing what that actually entailed. Just yesterday in our office, and by work I mean UW-Milwaukee campus where I work, there are students who are trying to type of attorneys or lawyers for litigation to see what might be able to be done, because students feel slighted that they were given is now costing them in a negative fashion. Now, regards to bankruptcy and student loans and all of that, slighted that they didn't receive the information that was necessary to have them carry out for their the goals and what they wanted. Now it's actually making them seek for information that they needed, which they could have used at the beginning to not have any of this come into fruition to begin with. So just to quickly reiterate, I think a lot of financial literacy, reaching out to students, giving them the necessary tools and information that they need to have, so that way they can always make informed choices and decisions. So I think the best we can do to prepare even future students is arm them with that knowledge and prepare them. That way it's up to them and their choice to go about how they want or that they need, without any problems or ramifications in the future because of not knowing something.
Very good. Thank you, Sylvie. I just want to check one more time if Renee is on.
Kathy, Renee is in my breakout group, session 4.
Oh, okay, very good. She's on my list here, so I just want to make sure to hear from everyone. Jamie, Sylvie mentioned kind of bankruptcy and the struggles there. Do you want to just give a few minutes on some of the happenings in bankruptcy related to student debt right now, and some of the things that you see on a regular basis? I think you're on mute, Jamie.
There we go. Thank you. I'm a bankruptcy lawyer in Milwaukee, and I'd say 60 to 70% of our clients that come to us have some student loan related issue. It's either the student loan borrower themselves or a parent that's done some sort of parent plus loan. Student loan legislation changed, God, 15 years ago, and made it a real challenge to discharge student loans. It used to be if the student loans were older than 7 years and the student loan borrower made an effort to pay back those student loans during that time period, that they could discharge those student loans. Now, student loans are very hard to discharge in bankruptcy. There's something that the judges utilize. It's called the Brunner test. Brunner test, so in order to discharge student loans in bankruptcy, someone must first file a bankruptcy petition in the bankruptcy court, and then they have to file a separate lawsuit within the bankruptcy court called an adversary proceeding, where they sue the lender, private or federal, and they sue the lender, and they have to prove that that currently they have no current ability to pay back those student loans. They have to prove that going forward in the future that their circumstances are unlikely to change. And then they also have to prove that they've made some reasonable effort to pay back the student loans. So the big challenge is that second prong, where they have to show that there's like certainty of that their circumstances won't change. So it's very difficult to discharge student loans. There was a case in New York that just came down that the judge, Cecilia Morris, lessened the stronghold of the Brunner test a little bit, and she actually discharged the student loan of a lawyer who had about $120,000 in student loans, and he chose not to practice law. He wanted to do something environmentally related and was making $35,000 a year. Much less than he would be making if he were a lawyer. And normally a bankruptcy judge would say, you know what, go practice law and pay back your student loans. But this judge, Cecilia Morris, really had the guts to say that we really shouldn't control what people are doing. They should be able to choose what they want to do. And she rendered those student loans dischargeable. So there's a lot going on right now with the judges discussing student loan dischargeability, but also Congress, Senator Warren came out with a very comprehensive plan on reforming bankruptcy laws to discharge student loans in bankruptcy. I know Biden has adopted those. So, we'll see what happens in the future, but I know it's a legislative issue as well.
Very good, thank you. I just want to make sure that I heard from all the student or the task force participants on our call. It looks like the rest of the breakout sessions are wrapping up and coming back in. One last comment, anyone? Let's see, Karen?
I just wanted to chime in about the bankruptcy piece. There are two other issues, and one of them is that people don't file for hardship discharges in bankruptcy because they're expensive. They have to pay an attorney usually thousands of dollars for those, which is another impediment regardless of the law.
Very good. And Michael, one quick one.
Yeah. Someone brought up, one of the speakers today brought up a statewide promise program. And to me, that deals directly addresses much of the student loan problem. If tuition is covered, then it doesn't deal with the whole cost of college, but it's a significant break. And since college education is supposed to be a public good, I know when I went, it was about $150 a semester. We need to think about that, and other states are doing it.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you all of you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. It looks like the rest of the group is coming back. So Michelle, I will turn it back over to you for instructions.
Great, thank you, Secretary. I'm gonna, as people are joining us, put the slide up just for a moment to get everybody back in the room. Before we begin, I want to make sure we have all of our facilitators present and accounted for. So everyone can just have a 1-minute stand-up stretch break if you weren't able to move. Everyone who is returning, we're just taking a minute to get the room filled back up as the other breakout sessions are ending and making sure our facilitators have a moment to summarize all the feedback and input that they received for their reports. So we'll get started in just a moment. Great. It looks like we are near close to everyone returning to the session. So we will begin with our report out activity. And here we want to hear from the 4 facilitators of the breakout sessions. I was fortunate to be able to sit in on the main room session, and it was great to hear everyone's voice and ideas and contributions. And we look forward to having more of these discussions and facilitated sessions at future meetings. So at this point in time, I will ask that Group 1, Secretary Blumenfeld, report out a summary of the 2 questions that were posed to the breakout rooms. The first one being, based on the first 3 meetings and your background, what do you believe to be the problem issues related to student debt that required change? And the second question is, based on what we just identified, what problems or issues do you believe the task force can identify solutions for, and what are those ideas? So at this point in time, I will stop sharing the PowerPoint so we can see all the facilitators' faces and their reporting out. So if you wouldn't mind, Secretary Blumenfeld.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. And thanks to group number 1. You were awesome in providing information. We also have the benefit, our scribe, Catherine Haberlin, was nice enough to scribe along. So a lot of our ideas are also found in the chat. But real quickly, in summary, I think some of the key issues for question number 1 is that there's just so much information, and it's, there's a ton of information out there. It's just not getting to people just in time when they need it, or having it in a consumable way where they can utilize it and use it to make probably some of the most, important financial decisions of their lives. The cost of loans being high, that private lenders at times can be making this even more challenging, or having mistakes related to that, a lack of financial literacy, and not enough focus on completing the FAFSA. And then for some of the solutions to the answer of question number 2, looking at, is there ways to extend the FAFSA deadline or put more resource to that? Looking into refinancing opportunities, providing more counseling, both before school, before entering higher education, and also while in school. What can be done to make sure that people are really understanding what they're taking out? More financial literacy, looking at a statewide promise program, and potentially looking at bankruptcy came up as an issue as well. Are there more we can do in that space in terms of helping borrowers? So I'll wrap that up and have you move to number 2.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. So group 2, we had Kevin McShane facilitating that discussion. If you would be so kind as to report out on the discussion that your breakout room had.
Sure, thank you. And again, I also wanted to say thank you to Marco. He provided the note-taking for our group, which was vital. I think the biggest thing is we felt a little pressed for time. Obviously, this is a really complex issue, and we look forward to future conversations as well. To answer the questions, based on the first 3 meetings and the people's background, what do they believe the problems and issues are? A lot of our discussions centered around financial literacy, and really at multiple points in the process. Again, well before they are even reach high school, certainly throughout high school and as they start college, but then also while people are in college and going into loan repayment, how do they make sure they understand what their situation is and how they can get themselves into the best situation from there. In addition to that, I think in general, what people felt like were surprises in the process, or things that they didn't feel were fair in the process. So I'll talk about that in the solutions part. And in addition to that, we did have some conversations around refinance and how it was important to make sure that things were affordable from a repayment perspective and how those are impacting the students. From the second question, based on what was identified, what problems and issues do we believe as a task force that we can identify solutions for? For that, we did have a lot of conversations centering around, the idea like a student bill of rights or a borrower bill of rights, knowing that there's protections that people need to make sure they're being treated fairly. Obviously, it's a complicated process enough as it is. Having people being taken advantage of in the process is obviously very problematic. So a lot of discussion around that. A lot of discussion around, again, the education process and how we can provide students with more information. There were examples given of institutions that are able to do that type of counseling and providing very detailed information on what loan repayment and financing options look like. But then also talking about the complexity of how that looks different at different institutions and things, if there's not financing support or other ways that, something like the state could contribute to a program like that. And then when we talked about, another solution potentially being refinance, one of the things that we talked about is certainly that the details are important, because in general, one of the concerns is that if it requires a certain level of credit rating and you will have a very limited amount of funds, just a concern that refinancing may not be the solution that is really helping the borrowers that are most heavily impacted by the situation at hand. So making sure that if we're looking at that as options, how does that play into, meeting kind of the charter of this task force and helping all students, not just a select portion. So those were some of the items we talked about. Obviously, many more details in the notes. Again, thank you to Marco for that, and I will hand it back over.
Thank you for that summary. And we will move on to group 3, where we had Kiamani Alford doing the facilitation.
All right, and thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to Cheryl, who was the scribe for our group, who captured all of the notes. Of course, I'll be summarizing some of this information, but based off of our conversations, a lot of our conversations really focus on the whole access piece and really identifying that there are some challenges, specifically when it comes into accessing or giving students access to grants, or things in the sense that will steer them away from borrowing debt. Then also really trying to understand as far as that the disparities, as far as when it comes into ethnicity and the whole economic aspect of it, and people of color specifically being ones that's borrowing the most and not fully being able to understand why. I mean, really not focusing, being able to focus on that whole aspect of, so the lack of financial education there for those students that they can understand as far as the whole impact of borrowing. And it's not clearly understood where that is. So some of the conversations was, even as we start looking at solutions, to really focus on having a system or infrastructure in place that really is able to look at the data to really help us to understand what that is. Also, of course, looking at as far as the whole burden of the processes when it comes into completing the FAFSA application and finding ways in the sense to be able to support students that are going through that process, so it's not hard when it comes to that. And then also looking at completion rates overall as well when it comes into borrowing and students actually not completing the actual program. Another component as far as that was an issue is the whole disparity as far as looking at racism and inequity within the schools, and then giving some data in the sense or some support to the institution to be able to support that, because there are some challenges that's built into the system that has provided some challenges overall when it comes into looking at student debt. Then as far as from the solutions, as far as what we can look at as far as a task force, need to have programs to help support all students that truly spans against or spans over all ethnicities, races, and things of that nature. And identify as far as what programs we actually can create to help support students of colors, and how can we make grants available to those that really need it. There was also some discussion as far as promise programs and some of the things that institutions have done individually, but also looking at that from the state level to see what we can do to support those students. So that kind of summarizes as far as some of the conversations that we had in our group.
Great summary, thank you. Very deep conversations there. And as it relates to a report from Group 4, Laura Sutherland, the facilitator.
Yes, hi. So one of the things about being number 4 is much of what we discussed has already been covered. So there's some symmetry on the task force, and that's a good takeaway from that. Thank you, Sophie, for being our scribe. I'm looking forward to reviewing those notes more thoroughly. But what I can tell you is our group talked a lot about many of the issues that have already been discussed, and that is my actually video on this time? It's not, is it? Is it on?
You just turned it off.
Okay, well, I don't see myself, so I was making sure it was on. Any event. Sorry, you guys. So we talked a lot about financial literacy as well, and had some great examples of how much information is being disseminated to folks already, but not in an effective way. We're not tracking it in a way that is really meaningful. So there are a lot of regulations in place that we understand in terms of getting necessary information out to folks about what they've borrowed. But we had examples from the Veterans Association about how they may be opening it, but they're not reading it, or they're not opening it at all. And it's not until they're in crisis. We heard this about folks going to for-profit colleges. It's not until they're on the back end of their degree or having dropped out perhaps, that they're actually reviewing this information and getting an understanding of their situation. So there was a real, robust conversation about getting out information, but getting it out in a way that people are ready to listen to it and digest it and use it, and putting state resources towards that, or resources, I should say, towards that. There was also a discussion around underrepresented populations and needing more data points on that. We had a nice conversation, obviously, in the last session about the effect of student loan borrowing on Black borrowers, still needing data points on that out of Wisconsin, but certainly needing more data points on First Nation, the effect on First Nation borrowers and other vulnerable communities. So looking for more information on those kinds of issues. But in terms of question one, what are the issues that our group identified? In addition to that, affordability, state investment, and repayment options. So in terms of solutions to these problems, we had a little bit of time on that. One issue I think someone else raised, but was discussed in our group, was the retention rates. There was a nice flag about retention rates and the correlation to that to default and borrowing. And so exploring what we can do as a state to address retention rates on the front end, and certainly resourcing issues around effective financial literacy before, during, and after school. And then there was some conversation about BBOR's Borrower Bill of Rights, as well as requirement for filling out the FAFSA. We wanted some more information on that before we thought that was a resolution that we wanted to explore. With respect to the FAFSA requirement, there was some real question about whether or not the outcomes of doing that were worth the work. In other words, is the juice worth the squeeze? It's a lot of resources that would go into requiring people to fill out a FAFSA, and some folks may not be actually going to school or using that form. So we'd like some more data on whether or not a program like that is actually an effective method. And with that, there was some conversation about whether or not using the mandate for filling out a FAFSA could also be a catalyst for financial literacy, getting people to understand their borrowing and going on the front end. And so if we could partner those two initiatives, maybe that would be a good exercise. And I think much of what we discussed was covered by the other groups as well. So thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed facilitating our great group of discussion.
Thank you to all four of our facilitators for leading those discussions. I know that the task force looks forward to having more discussions in the future on these topics as we continue to explore all the avenues and items on the future agendas of the task force. So speaking of future items, the next steps and next meeting, and what we have coming up for you in the future agendas. So we have our next meeting on June 24th this year, and it starts at 10 a.m. and will proceed until 1 p.m. again, and we will have that virtually via WebEx. And we just want to remind all the task force members and even public participants and listeners, viewers, to contact Student Debt Task Force at dfi.wisconsin.gov should you have any questions or speakers you hear from, or topics, or student borrowers, debt holders that you might want to hear from as well. And you can also view materials and agenda items and presentations at the website at lookforwardwisconsin.gov, Student Debt Task Force. But our next agenda will have presentations and discussions centered on consumer protection and loan oversight. In addition, we hope to arrange and hear from a borrower that has a success story, and I know that was of interest to members as it relates to the survey results that were received. So we do plan to have some overviews related to consumer protection and programs as well. Any feedback you have from this meeting as it relates to logistics or timing and issues, please get to me at michelle.reinen@wisconsin.gov. And with that said, related to our next meeting, I will turn it over to our chair, Secretary Blumenfeld, for final words and adjournment.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for a robust and healthy discussion related to the Student Debt Task Force. We will see you again in 3 weeks, so a little bit off our cadence of every other week, but we will be back on the 24th, and we'll cover the same, cover the topics that Michelle described, and look forward to hearing more from all of you. Today was just a drop in the bucket, but I know as our meetings go on, we'll make more and more time for conversation. We're trying to balance getting all the information into people's hands so that we can narrow down on some recommendations. But we'd love to hear from you at our Student Debt Task Force email if you have ideas in the meantime. So take care, everyone, and be well. Bye-bye.